So I've had the great privilege of traveling to some incredible places, photographing these distant landscapes and remote cultures all over the world. I love my job. But people think it's this string of epiphanies and sunrises and rainbows, when in reality it looks more something like this, right? This is my office. And we can't afford the fanciest places to stay at night, so we tend to sleep a lot outdoors. As long as we can stay dry, that's a bonus. And we also can't afford the fanciest restaurants, so we tend to eat whatever's on the local menu. And if you're in the Ecuadorian Paramo, you're going to eat a large rodent called a cuy. But what makes our experiences perhaps a little bit different and a little more unique than that of the average person is that we have this gnawing thing in the back of our mind that even in our darkest moments, in those times of despair, we think, hey, there might be an image to be made here. There might be a story to be told. And why is storytelling important? Well, it helps us to connect with our cultural and our natural heritage. And in the Southeast, there's an alarming disconnect between the public and the natural areas that allow us to be here in the first place. You see, we're visual creatures, so we use what we see to teach us what we know. Now, the majority of us aren't going to willingly go wade out into a swamp, right? So how can we still expect those same people to then advocate on behalf of their protection? We can't. So my job then is to use photography as a communication tool to help bridge the gap between the science and the aesthetics, to get people talking, to get them thinking, and to hopefully, ultimately, get them caring. Now, I started doing this 15 years ago, right here in Gainesville, right here in my backyard. And I fell in love with adventure and discovery, going to explore all these different places that were just minutes from my front doorstep. There's a lot of beautiful places to find. Despite all these years that have passed, I still see the world through the eyes of a child, and I try to incorporate that sense of wonderment and that sense of curiosity into my photography as often as I can. And we're pretty lucky because here in the South, we're still blessed with a relatively blank canvas that we can fill with the most fanciful adventures and incredible experiences. It's just a matter of how far our imagination will take us. See, a lot of people look at this and they say, oh yeah, wow, okay, that's a pretty tree. But I don't just see a tree. I look at this and I see opportunity. I see an entire weekend. Because when I was a kid, these are the types of images that got me off the sofa and dared me to explore, dared me to go find the woods and put my head underwater and see what we have. And folks, I've been photographing all over the world, and I promise you what we have here in the South, what we have here in the Sunshine State rivals anything else that I've seen. But yet our tourism industry is busy promoting all the wrong things. Before most kids are 12, they'll have been to Disney World more times than they've been in a canoe or camping under a starry sky. And I have nothing against Disney or Mickey. I used to go there too. But they're missing out on those fundamental connections that create a real sense of pride and ownership for the place that they call home. You see, we're a state that's surrounded and defined by water, and yet for centuries, swamps and wetlands have been regarded as these obstacles to overcome. And so we've treated them as these second-class ecosystems because they have very little monetary value, and of course they're known to harbor alligators and snakes, which I'll admit, these aren't the most cuddly of ambassadors. So it became assumed then that the only good swamp was a drain swamp. And in fact, draining a swamp to make way for agriculture and development was considered the very essence of conservation not too long ago. But now we're backpedaling because the more we come to learn about these sodden landscapes, more secrets we're starting to unlock about interspecies relationships and the connectivity of habitats, watersheds, and flyways. Now take this bird, for example. This is the prothonotary warbler. I love this bird because it's a swamp bird, through and through, a swamp bird. They nest and they mate and they breed in these old growth swamps and these flooded forests. And so after the spring, after they raise their young, they then fly thousands of miles over the Gulf of Mexico into Central and South America. And then after the winter, the spring rolls around, and then they come back. They fly thousands of miles over the Gulf of Mexico. And where do they go? Where do they land? right back in the same tree. That's nuts. This is a bird the size of a tennis ball. I mean, that's crazy. I use a GPS to get here today, and this is my hometown, right? So that's crazy. After setting up the platform, I look off and I see a kite coming over the cattails. And I see him scanning and searching. And he gets right over the trap. And I see that he's eating it. And he beelines, he goes straight for the trap. And in that moment, all those months of planning, waiting, all the sunburn, mosquito bites, suddenly they're all worth it.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe it.
You can believe how excited I was when that happened. But what the idea was is that for someone who's never seen this bird and has no reason to care about it, the idea is that these photos, these new perspectives, will help shed a little new light on just one species that makes this watershed so incredible, so valuable, so important. Now, I know I can't come here to Gainesville and talk to you about animals of the Everglades without talking about gators. I love gators. I grew up loving gators. My parents always said I had an unhealthy relationship with gators. But what I like about them is that they're like the freshwater equivalent to sharks. They are feared, they're hated, and they are tragically misunderstood. Because these are a unique species. They're not just apex predators. In the Everglades, they are the very architects of the Everglades. Because as the water drops down in the winter, during the dry season, they start excavating these holes called gator holes. And they do this because as the water drops down, they'll be able to stay wet and they'll be able to forage. And now this isn't just affecting them. Other animals also depend on this relationship, so they become a keystone species as well. So how do you make an apex predator, an ancient reptile, at once look like it dominates the system, but at the same time look vulnerable? Well, you wade into a pit of about 120 of them, and you hope that you've made the right decision. Still have all my fingers, it's cool. But I understand, I know I'm not going to rally you guys, I'm not going to rally the troops to save the Everglades for the gators. It won't happen because they're so ubiquitous. We see them now. They're one of the great conservation success stories of the U.S. But there is one species in the Glades that no matter who you are, you can't help but love too, and that's the roseate spoonbill. These birds are great, and they've had a really tough time in the Everglades because they started out with thousands of nesting pairs in Florida Bay, and at the turn of the 20th century, they got down to two nesting pairs. And why? That's because women thought they looked better on their hats than they did flying in the sky. But then we banned the plume trade. We banned it. And their numbers started rebounding. And as their numbers started rebounding, scientists began to pay attention. They started studying these birds. And what they found out is that these birds' behavior is intrinsically tied to the annual drawdown cycle of water in the Everglades, the thing that defines the Everglades watershed. And what they found out is that these birds started nesting in the winter as the water drew down because they're tactile feeders, so they have to touch whatever they eat. And so they wait for these concentrated pools of fish to be able to feed enough to feed their young. So these birds became the very icon of the Everglades, an indicator species of the overall health of the system. And just as their numbers were rebounding in the mid-20th century, shooting up, to 900, 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, just as that started happening, we started draining the southern Everglades. And we stopped 2/3 of that water from moving south. And it had drastic consequences. And just as those numbers started reaching their peak, unfortunately today, the real spoonbill story, the real photo of what it looks like is more something like this. That we're down to less than 70 nesting pairs in Florida Bay today because we've disrupted the system so much. And so all these different organizations are shouting, they're screaming, the Everglades is fragile, it's fragile. It is not. It is resilient. Because despite all we've taken, despite all we've done, and we've drained, and we've dammed, and we've dredged it, pieces of it are still here waiting to be put back together. And this is what I loved about South Florida, is that in one place you have this unstoppable force of mankind meeting the immovable object of tropical nature.